So nobody has any specific questions on what will be on the exam? No, you can ask if you have a specific question about something. You asked me, what was the question? Oh yeah, the common components. There's a whole bunch more. That essay question about the 5 common components of connective tissue, there's more than 5. You just got to list 5. Okay? We're ready for chapter 11. So everybody is clear on the fact that there's an exam on Thursday of this week. The only way you will be excused from the exam is if you have a doctor's note to be excused from the exam. Okay? Love you all, but if you're the person that says, well, I'm gonna call and say I'm sick that day because I'm going to study all weekend, and then when I come in, I'm going to make up the exam and I'm going to get 100. You're not going to get 100, and chances are you probably won't get too much more studying done either. So come in on the day of the exam, take the exam. If you do that to yourself, you put yourself behind. You put yourself behind, it's going to be harder for you to pass future exams. So don't do that. All right, yes?
We need extra time beyond the hour and a half.
No. Hour and a half is way more time than you need for my exams. If you need way more time than an hour and a half, you need to study more. Yes? Don't. That hour and a half is plenty. No more questions? Chapter 11. We're moving into what now? The nervous system. We're not going to forget about the integumentary system and the muscular system. We're going to shove those on the end of the semester. But the nervous system is very complex and can be very difficult to grasp. So I would rather take the time I need on the nervous system. What kind of cells are we talking about when we think about the nervous system? Neurons and supporting cells, you're correct. These cells, huge cells, are important for what? Message transmission. Now, the messages that are being transmitted through our system fall into several different categories. And this diagram shows us all of those guys. When you look at the chapters, you will see they're broken down into, how many more chapters on this subject? Has anybody looked?
On which side?
3 more. And guess what we're going to talk about specifically in those 3 chapters? These 3 guys. Okay? So when we talk about the nervous system, first in chapter 11 we're going to discuss how the cells do their thing, the neurons, and how they're supported by supporting cells. And then the other 3 chapters are going to talk about these specific divisions individually. So we have sensory information. When I yell at you in this lecture hall, what is that? That's sensory information being picked up by your sensory receptors. Give me an example of a sensory receptor. Your sense of smell. You're listening to me now, aren't you? You're taking in information from your environment. You're hearing, taste, sight, touch. Those are all information coming in for input. Now, when we talk about input, where are we sending that sensory information to? So when I talk to you, that information is being transmitted where? To your brain. Or hopefully you're sorting out what I'm saying. You can understand what I'm saying because Well, sometimes I think you can understand the words. The concepts sometimes are a little tough to sort out. But why do you understand what I'm saying up here? When I say the word say, you understand what that means. Because you have information stored in your integration center. I'm going to refer to that place as your file cabinet. And you have tons and tons of different information stored in your file cabinet. Like how to decipher language. Like that's the color red. Like that's a girl and that's a boy. Where did you get all that information from? You learned most of it, didn't you? As you grew, you got sensory information. You made files in your file cabinet about all of this information. And you use those files about all that information to respond to your environment. So the other part that we're going to discuss is what? Information coming out of the file cabinet. That's called what? Motor output. So if I do this, what'd you just do?
Jump.
Some of you woke up. Yes? What is that? That's motor. That's output. You heard something, a loud noise. Your integration center said, protect yourself. You blinked or pulled back. That's the motor response. Yeah, you kind of flinch. Even though you know the sound's coming.
You stop doing it.
Yeah, because you realize, okay, I know what's on the other end. Makes you go to sleep. Sounding, banging nails. Ah! All right, this diagram is going to help pull everything together for us. So between chapters 11 and chapters 14, we will talk about all of this stuff very specifically. Now, all of the stuff is breaking down those three things we just talked about in the previous diagram more specifically. So we have central nervous system. That is the big integration center. In order to get information up to the integration center, somebody's going to help me with that. Somebody close to me. Now that's going to feed into. But who's going to help transmit that information? Spinal cord, right? No, it's not all the same. Spinal cord and brain are different, right?
Right, but you just said integrative.
Yeah. Brain is where I'm going to file all my files, information stored. The spinal cord is going to do what? Bring the messages to and from those file cabinets. And that's what the central nervous system is all about. We have integrative and control centers there that are going to help bodily functions occur on a regular basis to maintain homeostasis. What are you doing right now without thinking about it?
Breathing.
You're breathing, yes? And hopefully your heart is beating, yes? Why?
Stay alive.
Your integrative and control centers are sending information to your peripheral nervous system, particularly the autonomic division of the motor or efferent division of your peripheral nervous system. Yes? You got that? By the time we finish chapter 14, you're going to be able to repeat that same sentence without even a thought. Okay? So all of these guys here feed into the central nervous system, the control center. The peripheral nervous system is outside the what? The central nervous system. So everything outside the central nervous system we call the peripheral nervous system. These guys are responsible for sending information to and bringing information away the processing centers. So if I bring information to, we call that sensory or afferent. Now, where am I going to get information from? Where does my central nervous system get information from? Yeah, we just talked about that, right? Somatic, things that are in where? In your body. Soma, body. Visceral. What's visceral? I'll give you a hint. They're going to make some delicious cheeseburgers in the cafeteria today. Your organs are going to send you information, your viscera. And these groups of information are going to be sent to the central nervous system via the peripheral nervous system for processing. The information coming out, my muscles contract. And muscles don't contract unless they get information from who? The nervous system. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the motor end plate and the neuromuscular junction when we hit the muscle chapter and we see how neurons are going to stimulate muscle contraction. These are motor or efferent. And they are also part of the peripheral nervous system. So information gets processed upstairs, then we send a message out to cause a result, either a muscle to contract. Or did anybody not eat breakfast this morning? Oh, a few hands. Just one? You're dead, right? No. Well, you what? You get nauseous? Drink your breakfast then. Not a margarita, but drink your breakfast. Yeah, no, that's not quite. Get a nice little smoothie or something going. So she doesn't have too much glucose floating around. Unless she put a little sugar in her coffee, that might give her a kick, right? Who monitors that stuff? Central nervous system. When your blood glucose levels go down, you can't walk around like that, can you? What do you have to do? You need to change that. You have to initiate some sort of negative feedback mechanism with a hormone relation to it. So you have to go break down stored things, maybe some glycogen in your liver or in your muscles. Who's going to help me do that? The brain's going to signal somebody. Hormones, pancreas. A pancreas called glucagon is going to be released because the central nervous system told it to. So that's another thing the nervous system can communicate with, the endocrine system, to help regulate body function. Question? Yeah, pretty much. So, conduction fibers are going to leave efferent division from the central nervous system, whether it be directly from the brain, if we're talking about cranial nerves and stuff that's going on up here, like me moving my mouth to talk to you. Who's causing that to happen? The spinal cord? No. I have something called cranial nerves that are going to help me move the muscles in my head. Okay? Yeah, you got to know all those too. So, muscles contract, glands to secrete something. These guys are going to help control bodily functions. So, of the motor division, the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system, we can break it down further. We can have things that happen that we call somatic. And I have what over somatic? I have conscious control. So when I move my hands and when I speak, I have conscious control over that. There's actually something going on in my brain. I'm saying I need to speak, send a message to my muscles in my face so I can move my jaw up and down, and then I can blow a certain amount of air through the trachea and the larynx so that I can talk louder or lower, and I can form the words that I want to say to you. That's all conscious, believe it or not. No, it's because they have a weird mouth. Okay? So, voluntary, somatic motor. Skeletal muscle. When we think about movements, those are voluntary. Then we also have the autonomic division of the motor or efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. And that is something that happens what? Yeah. I dare any of you right now to make your heart stop. Go ahead.
It stops. Yeah, mine stops on its own.
Can you stop your heart from beating? Can you stop yourself from breathing?
Yes.
No.
You die.
No, you can't.
Your body will automatically
Your body will automatically say, no, I'm overriding you. You can hold it for a very, very long time, but you cannot stop yourself. And there are some people that have great control over their autonomic nervous system. Certain exercises like relaxation techniques can bring down your heart rate quite a bit. But they do that because you are slowing down your thoughts and you are slowing down your breathing rate. You are breathing more deeply when you do those relaxation techniques. So there's not a big, huge need for oxygen when you breathe efficiently. You laugh at me when I tell you before a test, take a deep breath. Physiologically, that's going to help you think better, isn't it? Why? More oxygen in your body, more gas exchange. You slow all that other stuff down so your brain can get that information out onto the page. Yes?
So biofeedback is all
Yes.
about something to check your sweat on one finger, your pulse, your respiration. And when you start, when the computer tells you, oh, you're doing it, you're getting your heart lined up with your respiration or whatever, then you sense that feeling and you can recreate it. That's
Exactly.
get rid of pains and cancers and sickness.
Yep. And there's a lot to be said for how the nervous system works. You know when you're really tense and stressed out. Can you think straight? No, because your body's firing off all these other things. It's way too busy thinking about all those other things to think about the tests that you have to take. That's why people who fear the test practice those relaxation techniques. Another thing I'll give you a little hint too, because the test is coming up, I'll give you a little hint before we cover it in the nervous system. But your sense of smell is very closely related to where you store all of your memories. The tracks, the actual physical tracks in the nervous system are very close together. So smells can elicit memories. And have you ever experienced this? Certain holiday.
That's why they tell you, if you're studying, you put in like a tic-tac. You start, doing that.
That's exactly what.
It'll actually refer you back to
Yep.
what you were learning.
So when you study for your exams and you have a particular scent, like for example, think about something you can bring to class. So don't think about, like an aromatherapy candle, because I won't allow you to bring that to class. But a what? A bottle of rum? No, I won't allow you to bring that to class. But how about a Tic Tac or a mint, a certain scent, while you're studying? Guess what? You come to class, you take the exam with that same, well, not the same Tic Tac, probably another Tic Tac in your mouth. That's going to help you remember what you studied when you had that Tic Tac in your mouth before.
Sitting the same way and taking 2 deep breaths.
You don't necessarily have to sit the same way, but yeah, the deep breaths is going to calm you and allow that information to leave and not be blocked. I think of nerves and stress and anxiety as big giant boulders that, bam, sit right in front of that information you want to get to in your file cabinet. That's exactly what they are. If you can calm yourself down, that information will come. If it's there, it'll come. And believe me, it's there. I know you don't think it is. It's kind of like building a neighborhood when you build a memory. You get the bulldozers, you come in, you clear the land, you plop a house there. Now, in order to get to the house, what do you have to do? Build a road, right? And you have to probably pave the road because you live in Maine. You have to make sure it's accessible. The information is always there. It's the road to the information that you might have problems with. So how do you think? You ever take a walk in the woods? walk a path a long time, what happens to that path as you walk it over and over again? Yeah, you can see it in the road. It actually wears the path. Think of that when we think of building a memory. If I'm studying for an exam, the best way to build that path is what? Repetition. Repetition, repetition, repetition. If you can associate it with something familiar, even better. Right? So it's there, you just have to build the road. You have to make that path. And that's what your studying does. So, all right, where were we? I got sidetracked. Autonomic, somatic, all parts of motor. Then we have things that speed things up and things that slow things down. One of my favorite cookies is Hermit's. And when I hear, now the culinary arts students do experiment with those several times during the semester. Did you know they sell baked goods in the bookstore?
No.
Yes, that the culinary arts students bake, and they're quite delicious. So when I hear that there are Hermits for sale in the bookstore, my sympathetic division of my autonomic nervous system kicks in and mobilizes me and my muscles and my respiratory rate and my cardiovascular rate. Get up to the cafeteria right away and get those Hermits. Once I've obtained my Hermits, I will then sit down casually and eat them. Do I need all my systems sped up anymore? No, now I can rely on the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system to slow things down and conserve energy so I can consume my Hermits in peace. Yes? So, autonomic, automatic, we can slow it down, we can speed it up. Sympathetic, speed it up. If I yell at you right now and say, hurry up, get out of here, there's a fire, who's going to kick in? Automatically, a bunch of things are going to happen. Some of the stuff is sensory, some of the stuff is motor. I have to move, I have to gather my books, I have to leave this room. To do that fast, I'm going to need oxygen. So the sympathetic division is also going to help me muscle contract more. If I muscle contract more, I'm going to need more oxygen. If I need more oxygen, my cardiovascular system and respiratory system need to kick in. Do you see what I mean? Sympathetic. Once that's all done, parasympathetic's going to kick in, conserve energy, slow it down. Parasympathetic, when I do my relaxation techniques, is going to be vital for me. Slow things down, conserve energy. So, throughout these 4 chapters, then, we're going to talk about all of this stuff in detail. Who does what and when? The next thing the book talks about is something called neuroglia. Now, neuroglia literally means nerve glue. Do you remember, well, some of you haven't, if you're in Tuesday lab, you haven't looked at it yet, but when you look at neurons under the microscope, they are so big, you can actually see them before you put the slide under the microscope. They're enormous cells. And because of that, they need help maintaining themselves. The other thing about neurons, there's only a few exceptions to this rule, is what you got, you're not getting any more. Yes? They lose the ability to undergo mitosis. You have nerves, neurons, that's all you're getting. There's very few exceptions to the rule, and we'll talk about them next semester when we begin with special senses. But for the most part, especially your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system, the nerves you have now, that's it. You destroy them.
Damaged nerve, like their own nerve, you don't get that.
Nope.
It can heal itself, but it can't.
And we'll talk about regeneration of nerve fibers. That can happen. But if you kill the cell body of a neuron, that's it. You get no more. Okay, you can regenerate the fibers. We'll talk about that in this chapter. And we have so many connections that you might be able to reroute information, and we see this in patients who have had strokes. But the ones that die are gone forever. So, in order to maintain these cells, we have some help. And we have help from the neuroglia. There's several different types of neuroglia described in your book. The first one at the top is called an astrocyte. Please note, when you look at the nervous system tissue under the microscope, you're going to see those big honking neurons, and then you're going to see tons and tons of little nuclei all around them. All those tiny little cells around those neurons are the neuroglia. So astrocytes are one of the most abundant of the neuroglia. We find astrocytes in the central nervous system. So where are we going to find them? Brain, spinal cord. Do we find them outside the brain and spinal cord? No. So astrocytes are most abundant. They look like they're described in your book as branching sea anemones. Okay, whatever. They have arms. They hold things in place. They connect things. One of the important things they connect is the neuron, which is kind of in yellow, to its blood supply, which is the capillaries or red tubes. So they can help feed and give nutrients to neurons. Again, they're huge cells. I'll give you an example. You have a group of neurons that runs down a nerve called the sciatic nerve. The cell bodies of those neurons in that group nerve start here at the base of the spine and run all the way down your leg. That's how long the cells are. So astrocytes are going to provide, not that sciatic nerve, but astrocytes in the central nervous system are going to provide structure for these guys, a connection to their food supply. The other type of glial cell we'll find, again, in the central nervous system is something called a microglia. And a microglia is a phagocytic cell. So it eats stuff, exactly. It gets rid of debris. The other thing we're going to find when we talk about the central nervous system is there's lots of fluid floating around in there. The fluid's going to serve two purposes. One, well, three purposes. Provide nutrients for these cells and get rid of waste for these cells. And it's also going to provide protection. It's a cushion for these cells. Microglia are going to get rid of any debris from cells, any of those dying off glial cells, because the glial cells can reproduce themselves. So microglia, the phagocytic cell, is going to help defend the central nervous system against any foreign invaders. The next group of cells, also glial cells, are the ependymal cells. And ependymal cells are going to help with two things. One, they are going to be the sole producers of cerebrospinal fluid. They produce it. Yep. And the cilia is going to do what? Move it around. We want it to circulate through the central nervous system. The other thing it's going to do is provide something called the blood-brain barrier. This is one of the most difficult things for drug companies to overcome, the blood-brain barrier. Because these cells are very highly selective as to what they let into the cerebrospinal fluid. They're going to take fluid and nutrients from the circulatory system. That's how they make the cerebrospinal fluid. But they're very selective as to what they take in. So we'll talk about the blood-brain barrier when we talk about the central nervous system, and the ependymal cells are going to help set that up. Be very selective as to what it lets in. So drug companies can make an awesome, wonderful drug that will do whatever it is they're interested in doing. But if those cells won't absorb and allow that drug to come into the cerebrospinal fluid, it's not going to work. The other type of cell, again, still in the central nervous system that we're going to find, is something called an oligodendrocyte. An oligodendrocyte is going to provide insulation for the electricity that's being transmitted by the neuron. It creates something in the oligodendrocyte is in where? Central nervous system. Okay, we're still in the central nervous system. It's going to provide insulation for the axons that carry information from the cell body of the neuron and creates something called the myelin sheath. Do you ever look at the wires in your house? What are they? They're not just metal wires all hanging all over the place. If they are, that could be quite dangerous, right? Some of them, some of the older houses still have some of that scary electrical goings on there. What do your wires have to prevent them from firing other wires off? They have insulation. They're different colors. That'll tell you where they're going in the house, right?
Is that myelin sheath, is it polarized? Like, does it, because obviously it has to resist.
No, it's
Things, I mean,
well, all membranes are polarized in cells.
you know what I mean? Like, because it's an insulator, it has to make it so that obviously no electrical charge can get out.
Correct.
So it has to be able to.
Right, just like insulation in your house, though. Think about insulation in your house. Okay, is it polarized? No, it's just going to prevent heat, for example, from leaking. These are cells. They're actual cells that wrap themselves around
That's what I mean. Right?
the axons. So the membranes are polarized because they are cells, but they are going to help prevent electrical message from leaking out and firing off other neurons that shouldn't be fired off. The next and final one they mention in your textbook is something called a Schwann cell. And that we're going to find in the peripheral nervous system. It's the same thing as the oligodendrocyte, except it's in the peripheral nervous system. So the Schwann cell is going to provide insulation for axons, just like the oligodendrocytes did. It's going to provide the myelin sheath around peripheral nerves. Yes? So those are our glial cells. Now this is an example of one big honking cell. It's huge. That's a neuron cell body. And all of these little things coming off of it are projections. So when we talk about neurons, yes, question? The neurolemocytes.
And the satellite cells?
Satellite cells are usually around the cell body in the peripheral nervous system. Yeah. Yeah, they hover like a satellite. Yeah, those are there too. All right, so the neuron. This is which kind of neuron? Can you tell?
It's in the peripheral.
This is in the peripheral nervous system. How'd you know that?
It's the myelin sheath.
Yeah, you see the Schwann cells creating the myelin sheath. If this was in the central nervous system, what would it say there? Oligodendrocytes, correct. So this is a peripheral nerve, and we're going to talk about how it works.
Also, the ones in the central nervous system don't have nodes of...
Correct.
can't pronounce that.
Nodes of Ranvier.
Ranvier.
Yes. And we'll talk about those when we talk about how a neuron works. So, they have longevity. You got them when you were born. You still have most of them. Yes? You made a few new ones for a little while, and then that was it. You were done. Neurons are what we call amniotic. What's that mean? Yeah, fluid-filled communication. When we talk about the communication between neurons, we're going to talk about the movement of charged particles. What do we call those? Oh yes, the chemistry is coming back. Ions. So the movement of charged particles through the membrane or projection or process of this cell is how it transmits its messages. Because of the fact that they work and work very hard at what they do, and like your neurons that are constantly monitoring your heart rate, and your neurons that are constantly monitoring your breathing rate, and your neurons that are constantly monitoring just slight movements in your muscles so you can even hold your head up while you're conscious, they have a very high metabolic rate. What does that mean? They use a lot of energy. Neurons, for example, like to have lots and lots of glucose. Why? Does anybody know why glucose and not lipids or proteins, or why glucose? No? Good guess. Energy. Energy production. That's the bottom line. If I use glucose, I'm going to get the most energy bang for my buck. When we talk about cellular respiration next semester and the production of ATP, we're going to see that if I have a glucose molecule, I can get the most ATP for the chemistry that goes on to make it. I can use other molecules, but they're not going to give me as much ATP as glucose does. So, what does your brain like to use? Glucose. Not breaking down lipids. Your muscles are fine with that. They're quite happy. They're good. Your brain is not. So has anybody ever gone on one of those very restrictive carbohydrate diets because they want to look beautiful and gorgeous? What's one of the bad things about those diets? Yeah, you tend to get very tired. You have trouble thinking. Okay, how come? Yeah, your brain wants the carbo. It doesn't want to use the lipids. It doesn't want to use the proteins. So you have to balance those. Take my nutrition class in the spring and we'll talk about that. So, yeah, and that's why you should make sure you feed yourself before you come to an exam. Right? Because you want your brain to work. You want to give it all the energy it needs to do its work. So, glucose is what it needs. It cannot survive for more than a few minutes without what? Besides glucose. In order for me to make all that energy, what else do I need? Oxygen. Okay? I can make energy without oxygen, but not nearly as enough as I can make with oxygen. So that's why you need to breathe, to bring in oxygen, get rid of waste products, carbon dioxide, so that you can make enough energy for your cells to survive.
So pretty much what you're saying is you gotta eat breakfast, you gotta breathe, eat Tic Tacs, quit smoking.
Yep.
You get an A.
And you get an A. No smoking, eat Tic Tacs, eat breakfast, breathe, and make your roads. Right? You gotta repeat, 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 and you're good. Right? All right. So the neuron cell body, very, very large. This is where the nucleus is contained. When we talk about the nervous system and connections, sometimes we see these neuron cell bodies hanging out in groups in different places. When we talk about the peripheral nervous system feeding into the spinal cord, we'll talk about things called ganglia. And ganglia are actually groups of neuron cell bodies for different connections throughout the body. Another thing we'll see in the neuron cell bodies is lots and lots and lots of well-developed Golgi apparatus. Because one of the things the neuron has to do is produce something called a neurotransmitter. That's how it's going to communicate with its neighbors. It's going to secrete these neurotransmitters, these substances that are going to then stimulate who's ever next in line. And I keep pointing to the end here at the axon terminals because that's where I secrete these neurotransmitters from a neuron. So if I produce them all the way up there in these highly complex Golgi apparatus, I have to then transport them down this process called the axon to the end, the axon terminal. And those little neurotransmitters are going to be in packages.
So is there only one axon terminal on a neuron?
No, there's actually many.
So that's also part of the dendrite?
No, this is an axon, and the axon terminals can branch from that axon. Dendrites are going to receive information.
Okay.
So when we talk about information being passed, the dendrites, those processes are the receiving end of information. Then the nucleus and the cell body are going to then allow that information to pass down the axon.
I guess what I'm asking is the axon is only one on a neuron.
Not necessarily, sometimes different neurons, depending on what kind of neurons, like a bipolar neuron, for example, can have more than one axon. But the axon is where the information leaves. The axon terminals on the other end can be highly branching. So one axon from one neuron can have many different axon terminals, the end portion. This is where I'm going to release the chemicals to communicate with the next thing in line. Now the next thing in line can be another neuron. The next thing in line could be a muscle. The next thing in line could be, what else? What else do I communicate with if I'm a neuron? No, that's a muscle. Muscle. Who else can control body function? Hormones, endocrine glands. Okay? So this is the communication end of any given axon. So when we talk about neuron processes, we talk about dendrites that receive that information, and then axons that actually allow that information to leave and go on to the next customer in line. It's a conducting region. And when we talk about dendrites and axons, we're going to talk about integral proteins that are very important in the communication process. Everybody knows what I just said, right? Now we're going to go back to the other stuff you used to have to know when we talked about the plasma membrane. Remember the plasma membrane? What was the plasma membrane made of? Phospholipids, cholesterol, and proteins. Now some of those proteins are integral proteins. What's that mean? They span the distance of the plasma membrane. Some of them are receptors for neurotransmitters. And we're going to find many of those on the dendrite end of the cell. So when neurotransmitters or whatever stimulus fires off a neuron, again, when we talk about special senses, we're going to talk about different kinds of stimulus. Guess what? That's stimulus. What did I just do to my thumb? I provided pressure. I feel something, don't I? That's a stimulus, pressure. Light, what is that? Light waves can come in and stimulate who? My retina, my photoreceptors. They're going to then send information down my optic nerve to my brain for processing. That's a stimulus. What is it? Sound waves. Sound waves are going to fire off neurons in your inner ear. Those are then going to send messages down your vestibulocochlear cranial nerve 8 for processing in your brain. Yes? You're going to know all this by the time we finish these chapters. Okay? So, dendrites have receptors or some sort of proteins that are going to change what goes on in the cell depending on what the stimulus is. Now, the stimulus can also be a neurotransmitter from an axon terminal of a neuron in front of that, for example. So, those receptors are very important for changing what goes on in the cell. Question on the other.
So if you're looking at that picture, how would you decide or determine, I guess, rather, which are the dendrites and which?
It would be very difficult to do that. If I had to guess, it would be, that would be my axon. Only because it seems to be the longest projection in this particular cell. The dendrites tend to be shorter, and they feed more into the cell body. It would be difficult to do that, and what you would have to do is apply different staining techniques that would pick up different aspects. For example, if you wanted to find the axon, if you could pick up a staining technique that would stain your Schwann cells, then boom, it would be easy to see. But it's difficult to see on this. Plus, you have such a small view. If I can see where some of those projections are going, it will be easier for me to see. So,
When we do that in lab, will you be able to tell that?
you can tell a little bit better because you have a bigger picture, especially on a lower power.
Right, that's good.
Yeah.
The axons are a little bigger, aren't they?
Not necessarily. Physically, not necessarily. So, axons, then, the transmission end of the fiber world when we talk about a neuron, bringing information away from the cell body to someone else, is wrapped in the myelin sheath. When we talk about peripheral nerves, the myelin sheath is made of something called Schwann cells. And have you ever gotten from the dentist that little long tube that you stick at the end of your tube of toothpaste and you wind it up? I'm cheap, so I enjoy things like that because I want to get every last little bit of toothpaste out of my tube, right? But that's how the Schwann cell wraps itself around an axon. It sort of squeezes all of everything to an end, including the nucleus and some of its other organelles, and wraps itself around the axon to provide insulation for the axon. So if I take a cross section, and that's what this little picture down here is, of an axon, I see the inner workings of the cell in the center of this circle, and that outer collar, that thick outer collar I see, is the myelin sheath. And it's very similar to what happens to your tube of toothpaste around that little key thing. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say that? Okay. So the myelin sheath is going to provide insulation. Not all of your neurons are myelinated, but the ones that are non-myelinated aren't going to be as fast. They're not going to be as fast because they're going to lose some of their charge as that information is passed down the axon. So myelinated fibers are going to provide information much more quickly in the pathway of information being sent. Anybody have toddlers ready to potty train? Yeah? You want them to do that right away, right? Because diapers are kind of expensive and, you know, the whole pee and poop thing. It gets old after a while, doesn't it? The only time that your child will be ready is when the pathway of information has been myelinated, because it's unmyelinated right now. When I talk about the pathway of information, I talk about your conscious control of information being sent to your bladder and your intestines to void. The only time your child will be ready to potty train is when those fibers have been myelinated. So any amount of Cheerios or party targets that you put in the toilet, it's not going to work until that happens. Yeah, that's kind of the switch that turns on. The best thing to do is show them what they need to do, but they're not going to be able to do it until myelination has taken place. So some children do that early, some children do that later. But again, it's not going to happen till that happens. So myelinated fibers are going to pass that message much more quickly. And myelination in the central nervous system is going to happen with our wonderful little oligodendrocytes. When the myelin sheath wraps itself around the axons, it actually looks physically white because of the way the cells appear from a distance. So if I have a whole bunch of cells that are myelinated in any given group, it actually looks white. When you look at brain tissue, and we'll do that this semester in lab, when we dissect the sheep brain, we're going to see that there's parts of it that look white and parts of it that look gray. The gray, white matter and gray matter. White matter is all myelinated, or for the most part, myelinated fibers of neurons. The gray matter is either unmyelinated fibers or the cell bodies themselves, because those don't have myelin around them.
What is that called?
White matter and gray matter.
I know, but it's called gray something. It's
Humor?
gray, root. I was doing it last night, doing everything, but
Oh,
it's called something else.
I don't know. All right, so I think if I say one more thing about neurons, you'll explode. So that's good. We're done. And any questions?